All right, we're here on November the 27th, 2005, and I'm here with Bill Black Jr.
And you are...
And I am Will Black, and I am this person's son, who you're looking at. Okay, go ahead, Dad.
And
We're here to talk today about what?
am going to give some personal recollections and recount some thoughts told to me by others about the leadership qualities that my father, William R. Black, had during his lifetime. This is Will's grandfather. Bill Black, my father, was a very outstanding athlete in high school. He grew up in Paducah. He was born 1920, so he was a teenager during the Depression. And he once explained to me that here in Paducah, during the Depression, when few had enough money for exotic entertainment, the high school athletics provided entertainment for the community, and the community followed the high school athletic teams closely, and it was a source of uniting the city. He was a very outstanding athlete, was an all-state quarterback his senior year, playing for Tillman High School. He was also captain of the football team and captain of the basketball team his senior year, and was almost elected captain of the basketball team when he was a junior. Very unusual, I would think, on anyone's team. And I think that Mr. McWright might have intervened so that in hopes that he wouldn't be elected too soon, and that his leadership could be saved up for his senior year. Because Mr. McWright was a football coach, and Mr. Denning was the basketball coach at that time. But as a high school student, I do remember one time Dad saying that he had been elected president of the drama club at Tillman, but never acted in a play. It says something about how his peers regarded his leadership, though. When he had a football scholarship to the University of Kentucky, he was injured severely with very bad knee injuries. And
What year was that in
he played. I think that he played freshman year. May have been early. It may have been late freshman year or early junior or early sophomore year when he received that knee injury. It was a blow. It was a block sideways against his knee that someone threw, and Ed Hank, who was a year or so older than Dad, happened to be. He was also a student at UK, and he happened to be in the stadium watching the practice. And he was across the field from where Dad was at the time that he was injured, and he said that he heard his knee injury across the field as though it were a rifle shot. It was so loud. At any rate, he was such a good spirit on the team that he stayed on the team. He kept his scholarship, but didn't get to play as much as he would have had that not occurred. He also was a member of the baseball team at UK, and he was in the class of 42 in college. So this was the first class to graduate from college after the Pearl Harbor attack. So he was already in the Army ROTC at UK, and he finished out his senior year. In fact, the baseball coach joined the Army and left, and Bill Black became the player coach for UK's baseball team and is listed in UK sports history as the varsity baseball coach for the season of 1942, which is pretty remarkable to have a player also being the varsity coach. And Granddaddy reflected one time to me years later that was quite a task, keeping his fellow peers in line on the road trips so that they could get enough rest to play a competitive game. In the Army, his commission from UK was in the infantry, but his knees were so damaged that he couldn't qualify for infantry duty in the Army. But he was trying to get overseas to get into combat. He was assigned instead to the Transportation Corps. This is why he ended up in New York City at the port of embarkation, and where he met my mother, Jenny Giblin. And she was an art student at the Cooper Union and also worked for an insurance company to help pay her way through college. He had applied, before they met, while he was in New York City, he had applied for a transfer to the Army Air Corps in hopes of getting overseas that way, thinking that the Army Air Corps physical requirements might not be as stringent as the infantry. But he found that even the Army Air Corps wouldn't let him go overseas with the condition of his knees. And he ended up being an instructor for bombardiers in the B-29, which was the largest, most advanced bomber of World War II. When he got out of the Army, it was shortly after I had been born in New York.
Now let me stop you there.
Yeah.
When he was a bombardier, or a bombardier instructor, I recall you saying that he did get orders to go over, but that the war was over. By the time he finally did get the...
I don't know that. I don't remember that. That would be something interesting for us to check out. But I don't think that's. Okay. I don't think that's right. Okay. I think he did get one army doctor to say that it was okay for him to go. This is when he was a bombardier. But another doctor who looked at him countermanded that judgment and said he was amazed that the first doctor would have approved him for combat duty overseas with the condition that his knee was in.
Okay.
After he got out of the Army in 1945, after the war. He was chosen to be in Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Finner, and Bean, that investment stockbroking company. He was chosen to be in their very first young executive class. Merrill Lynch had been without new young executives during the course of the war, and realized their executives were getting older and they needed to plan and recruit younger men. He was a member of that very first class. Later it became a famous institution, I remember him saying that on an occasion or two, Mr. Bean himself instructed the class. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Finner, and Bean. I think now it's Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Finner, and Smith. And he was assigned to the office in Louisville, Kentucky. Merrill Lynch was looking for young men with a geographical diversity, and intended to send them back to their home states to work. And he enjoyed working. He respected Merrill Lynch a lot and enjoyed. They were men who were very honorable, and he didn't enjoy stockbroking, though. He didn't. I think he was working in the commodities market in Louisville, but he felt a little frustrated at never seeing daylight, and wanted to be outdoors more, and had an opportunity to come back here to Paducah and join his dad, my grandfather, Ray Black, Will's great-grandfather, and the company then became Ray Black and Son. And his leadership was evident in that company, and his abilities, the understanding of finance that he got from Merrill Lynch and investments gave the company increased potential. Granddad Ray's expertise and experience in construction that he had already was a nice combination to be with. The two of them were, and the company did grow and prosper under the leadership of both of them. And he was always humble, and he could. He was much liked and respected, and often I've had people who were his age tell me how much they loved him and appreciated his leadership.
Another question I have is, when he was in that young executive class, he I guess he was with a bunch of people from Ivy League schools, and then can you tell me about that and how he fared?
He was in some pretty. He was with some very talented peers in that Merrill Lynch class. Some of them had majored in economics in college. There were a number of Ivy League graduates there.
And he majored in education.
He had majored in education at UK and intended to be a football coach. I'm sure he'd been inspired by Mr. McWright, who was a monumental hero and mentor at Paducah Tillman High School, and so a lot of what he was learning at Merrill Lynch was for the first time, and he applied himself diligently and ended up with the high score in the final exam in that young executives class. So he was remarkable in that way. He very intelligent, very smart, and yet humble, likable, good leader, but not arrogant. It was the most ideal combination of qualities that you could imagine in a person. Um, Someone that people wanted to follow. And he never sought glory for himself. Uh, these uh, these marks of his leadership that I'm listing, I've gathered, over his lifetime, or over my lifetime of exposure to him. He didn't talk about his own exploits all that much. Wouldn't talk if I asked him about them. And he in the community, he was really crucial. He was elected to the school board, public school board in Paducah. And actually, he was chosen to finish an unexpired term of a board member who left the board in 1954, right before Brown versus Topeka. And his leadership during that period was critical for the Paducah Public Schools. He served on the school board 22 years, and of that, in that span of service, he was the chairman for 18 years. So that's a rather profound influence that he had on the Paducah Public Schools at that time. And in your thesis, you interviewed him in that and documented leadership that documented a smooth racial integration that took place in Tillman, an effective one, let me put it that way. Not totally smooth, there were blips, but it was marked by good faith on the part of both races trying to work constructively together to make racial integration succeed in the public schools here in Paducah. And he, in a number of different organizations he was in, he served as president. He joined Rotary Club rather late in his career. I would say it was in the 1970s when he joined, so he would have been over 50 years old, maybe 55 or so. But within 5 years, he had been made the president of the Rotary Club, and he was chair of the Easter Seal Center for many years. I think he may have served some incredible length of time, like 40 years or so, on the Easter Seal Center Board of Directors for the local chapter here in Western Kentucky. And he had was a member of a club called the First Investors. He had been their president. Had been president of the Associated General Contractors chapter here in Paducah 2 different times. It was at the University of Kentucky. He served 4 terms as, well, no, he served 16 years. He had been appointed by 4 different governors of Kentucky to be a member of the Board of Directors of the University of Kentucky. And in that capacity, he served at a very critical time on a committee, and I believe he was the chair of this committee that was trying to resolve how to make it possible for the University of Kentucky Medical School to continue. It was it looked as though the problems were so enormous that there was doubt that they could be solved, and he took that one on and was the chair of it. Recently, this past summer, I was talking with Al Smith, the noted journalist who covers Kentucky, Courier Journal journalist. We see him on Kentucky educational TV frequently. And when he heard my name, he asked me if I was related to Bill Black, in an earlier generation of Bill Black from Paducah. And I said, yes, that had been my father. And he told me that he also served on that committee and bore witness to what a wonderful leader your granddad Bill was, and how he effectively worked with people, and what a wonderful service he gave leading that committee successfully in a situation that really looked dismal at the beginning. And I appreciated that very much. Here 30 years later, his remembering that. He served on the board of directors for the Beverly Farm Foundation for about 30 years or so, and was the president of the foundation. This is where my brother David, Bruce Black, had been a resident for about 30 years, a home for the retarded and mentally impaired. And my father, Bill Black, was president of that, and at a time in the 1980s when they were facing tremendous change being forced on them by the state of Illinois, which seemed to threaten Beverly Farm's very existence. Really tough challenges to upgrade the facility to bring their philosophy in line with modern philosophy and understanding of the mentally impaired. And he persevered through that and led the organization to a successful triumph in facing that challenge and accepting it. And it helped Beverly Farm to improve. Beverly Farm had been at the cutting edge of enlightenment for working with the mentally impaired when it was started around 1897. Prior to that time, retarded people very often were kept in asylums, locked up in conditions somewhat like prisons. And Beverly Farm took the approach of giving them more freedom, letting them be free to be outside, and this was a rural setting at the time, and to provide a pleasant place for the residents to live. So challenging them to learn all they were capable of learning, to achieve all that was possible for them to achieve, seemed a little stressful to many of the parents. Beverly Farm Foundation was owned by the parents, and it was a difficult change to make, but it ended up in the long run being good for Beverly Farm. And Granddad was very critical in that leadership of that. I'm sure I'm leaving out some of the positions of leadership and responsibility that he held during his life. And it would be good to check some of these out, but it's interesting to see that thread of or that theme in his life of having leadership and being willing to serve, where the situation required some strong leadership and deep understanding of people and situations, and an ability to have established firm direction after being flexible in building an understanding of the problems that they were facing. And he's much appreciated for that in circles where people, for example, like Al Smith, who served with him, recognize that kind of contribution. Granddaddy never bragged about those accomplishments, and I would say it's because he was secure enough with who he was that he didn't feel the need to boast about himself, and he didn't. It really was not the focus of what he was up to. And it was wonderful growing up close to him, because I was privy to some of those ongoing challenges that he was facing, and I was rather awed at the time to see how he handled some of them.
When you were growing up, when you asked him about some of these challenges, what were some of his? Was there a particular style with which he responded, or approach that he took to problem solving that was evident in how he talked about it?
He was positive. He correctly understood the complexities of the challenges. He correctly understood the seriousness of them, and could shake his head in wonder of how they were going to overcome these problems. But he didn't give up on them. He didn't say these problems can't be solved. He didn't worry till he exhausted himself over them. I think that Dad trusted in the Lord a lot, in a very personal way, and I think that he was able to grapple with these sometimes in the immediate sense problems that seemed impossible, and not become exhausted, but do the best he could, and then not worry about them. And I think to a big degree his positive outlook and his optimism was infectious in a group that he was a part of, and it was not an optimism that ignored reality. It was an optimism in the face of reality. It was an optimism despite reality, but fully comprehending it. It was the most magical, balanced combination of um, being tuned in to the world, but not being bowled over by it.
You mentioned his trust in God. What he was very active in the churches here. Could you explain his history with Paducah churches?
Yes.
And maybe his leadership in those churches.
Well, and his is a very interesting story. Granddaddy Bill, your Granddaddy Bill, was raised in the Baptist church here in Paducah, First Baptist Church. He and Mom met at a Knights of Columbus dance in New York City. It would have been what in my generation we called a mixer, where young men and young women had a chance to meet one another socially in the circumstances of a dance. And these were sponsored by the Knights of Columbus Club in Brooklyn, where my dad was staying during the war while he was stationed there in Brooklyn. And my mother was she was substituting for a hostess who could not be there that night. By irony, neither Mom nor Dad was Roman Catholic, but each assumed the other was because of the circumstances of where they met. It turned out my mother was an Episcopalian, and they were both, they each realized that they were in love with the other fairly soon in this relationship, and I think that each was taking a deep breath, figuring that they probably would marry this Roman Catholic and have to abide by all the rules of the church at that time, which were quite restrictive, unlike the Roman Catholic Church of today, which is much more flexible and not so rigid in its treatment of marriages to non-Roman Catholic partners. So when they moved back here to Paducah, Granddaddy Bill continued to go to the Baptist church. I think that he wasn't totally at home in the Anglican tradition. Granny Jenny was not at home in the Baptist tradition either, and so she went to Grace Episcopal Church, and as we children grew up, we went with her to church and were raised as Episcopalians. And we occasionally visited First Baptist Church with Dad, but it was not very often. And every once in a while he would visit or come to special occasions at Grace Church. And then he was a leader in First Baptist Church. He was on their board of deacons. And he later switched to Grace Episcopal Church, not because he was dissatisfied with his experience at First Baptist Church, but just to be with the family. He thought that was important. I remember one time asking him why he didn't visit more often, and it was at a time in my own development. I was about in 6th or 7th grade when I had a more narrow view of the faith, and I was worried about his soul as a Baptist, and that was kind of at the back of my motivation. I didn't say that to him, but I later have felt rather ashamed of that narrow outlook, even if I was a kid at the time. But so at Grace Episcopal Church, and I think that the particular rector who was there at that time, his name was J.F.G. Hopper. He was Mr. Hopper. He wasn't Father Hopper. Back then, at least here in our local area, the Episcopal priests were addressed as Mr. So-and-so. And Mr. Hopper was the kind of priest that I think that Granddaddy Bill could relate to. He was he was bold and aggressive. He was an aggressive leader, and I remember Mr. Hopper very fondly too. And when I was a boy growing up under his spiritual leadership, I considered it a very I considered it to have been a blessing to me. Although he was bold and strong and aggressive in his leadership, and sometimes offended some people, wasn't just all rosy and full of sweetness. But in Grace Episcopal Church, Granddaddy's adopted spiritual home, he was elected to the vestry and there, and seen as a leader there, and as well as where he came from, First Baptist Church.
He was even he was on the vestry late in life, right? I mean,
yes.
Where he was at at a time when he was asked to come on the vestry to guide the church through financial troubles. I think I remember that.
I don't remember that particular circumstance.
Okay.
If you do,
well, I remember
explain it to me.
It was while Father Yeager was here. While Nick Yeager was while he was rector of the church. I remember Granddaddy going back onto the vestry, and he was in his 70s, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And but I think he was, for some reason, I remember someone telling me that he was asked because of his expertise in guiding an institution through some type of financial difficulty, or maybe it wasn't a financial difficulty. It may have just been some new project they were working on that they were trying to finance, but it had to do with keeping the.
I vaguely think that's right. I do remember something similar to that you're talking about.
It was when I was in high school, I think, or maybe when I was in college.
Yeah. And that raises another position of leadership that he had at Citizens Bank. He was a director for a number of years there, and he had a good effect in these groups like that he was with. He would bring a compassionate sense to these groups, and yet and he was able to do that because he's also realistic. He was not. He had very high ideals, very high personal standards of honor. He was in the nicest sense, he was an idealist, but he was not an unrealistic idealist. He people felt comfortable under his leadership because he was a realist and was a sound. His judgment was sound, and his people were confident in his leadership, so that he could go from spiritual traditions as different as Baptist and Anglican, and was respected and revered in both groups. Um, and um, uh, he uh, he believed in supporting leaders that were, for example, a superintendent or a rector. Not just abandoning them because of a particular unpopular position that they may have taken on an issue. Um, he had staying power and patience with people, and he would help people improve. I remember his working with some a director or two at the Easter Seal Center way back decades ago that was lacking some leadership abilities, and he supported them as long as they were in that position and worked with them, helped them get through situations and improve. On the other hand, he could recognize if someone needed to be in a different place and couldn't ultimately succeed at a job, he could recognize that too, and convince them that was probably what the situation was. And even on something like that, he could remove someone from a position and not be destructive about it, but leave that person still able to respect themselves and be hopeful about their own personal future. He was the nicest sort of man to work for. The men in construction all loved him and respected him. It was really a blessing to be around him. It's just truly a blessing. And I think of how much better our city is that he ended up back here than if he had not come back here. The marks of his leadership are rather deep in the community. And he has inspired a number of people who've gone on to make contributions themselves in the community. So, it's something that I think I'm glad to get a chance to testify to his leadership and the quality of his character as it relates to that, because he certainly wasn't boasting about those achievements himself.